the macroeconomic environment is impacting wearables, which would make sense given its more discretionary items. And when it comes to services, he talked about digital ad spend, and we're seeing the macro environment. They're seeing the macroeconomic environment have an impact there. What are your headline takeaways?
Yeah, so I think the first one is the good news. So like many other companies, Apple faces the same headwinds that you already mentioned: the recession, it's inflation, it's uncertainty, it's the supply chain, and so forth. I think Apple benefits, though, in a few ways. The first one is about 2/3 of its sales come from smartphones. Folks consider that to be a necessary device, and they upgrade that far more frequently than they do a PC or a tablet or the other devices that they own. And the second thing that you already mentioned, or you and Emily, you and Ed mentioned, that I think is really important, is Apple does have a more affluent customer base. When you look in the United States, the iPhone owner has a household income that on average is $18,000 higher than an Android owner. 35% of their households have an income of more than 100 grand, and they're 3 times as likely to have an income of more than $300,000 a year. So Apple does benefit from having a more affluent customer base in the United States and abroad.
Now, this was interesting from Tim Cook. He said they expect revenue to accelerate in the September quarter, despite seeing some softness in some areas. He said they do believe there were some macroeconomic headwinds that affected the business in the June quarter that I already discussed, but sounded optimistic despite some of the softness that we've seen. I was trying to get him to give me a real take on whether or not we're going into a recession, and, always hesitant to try to sound like an economist. But what's your takeaway from that?
So if I were Tim Cook, I would also be optimistic. I think if we look specifically at the U.S. market, which also has a lot of parallels globally, almost 60% of U.S. consumers own an Apple device. So they're likely to buy a second. They're likely to buy into some of the streaming services, use Apple Pay, and use some of in the category that's growing the fastest for Apple. The second thing that we know that is about 18 or 19% of consumers only own Apple devices and are very locked into that ecosystem. So while generally all companies are facing some headwinds, Apple's looking and has a customer base that's that should help them sail through here a little bit easier than some of their competitors.
Now, supply was another point of optimism in this discussion. When you look at the numbers, of course, we remember last quarter, Apple said that they would expect $4 to $8 billion. You could potentially, just shave that off the top due to supply constraints. He said it actually ended up being lower than the lower end of that range. And he also said they saw, quote, significant improvement in the month of June in China on the supply side and the demand side. He specifically talked about strong demand around the June 18th holiday, the big shopping holiday in China, said they're seeing strong results there. And they're about to start a big promotion in China, a fairly rare sales promotion where a series of Apple devices will be discounted for a few days. And he said that had nothing to do with clearing inventory. What does that signal to you about the state of play in China?
Well, he said, I'm not a specialist on the Chinese market, but it does, indicate, I think it looks like they're willing to invest a bit. China's a gigantic market, and Apple has always been compared to the Chinese incumbents, it's been a relatively small player. So I think it's worthwhile for Apple to invest there and try to grow that base. Because one of the things that we know about people with Apple products, if you can get them to buy one, they're more likely to buy 2 or 3, and then they're more likely to buy into the services. So I do think it's an important market for Apple to invest in and try to gain some ground, especially starting with smartphones in that market.
Now, a key question has been, how are they going to invest if indeed we are looking at a recession ahead? Our Mark Gurman has reported that Apple plans to slow hiring, slow spending in some areas across some teams next year, which is a little less drastic than what we've seen, certainly layoffs. We've seen hiring freezes at other big tech companies. Cook says, we believe in investing through downturns. We've always done that and found that's made us stronger on the other side. Obviously, we're being deliberate in our decisions of where to invest. What do you make of that word, deliberate?
So if I were to try to guess what Tim Cook is thinking, and if I were to say deliberate, I would either be focused on things that consumers notice, which is the hardware, right? There's a lot of upgrades and a lot of things that every company is doing involving artificial intelligence, anticipating what I need, getting better at like loyalty and security and things like that. I think some of those things consumers are less likely to notice. So if I were him, I'd be investing in the hardware side because that's what really pops for consumers. And then there's some other things that simply have a long lead time, whether it's things like augmented reality or the metaverse or like payments. There's a lot of things that if you pause now, it has a longer, it has a bigger impact further down the road. So I would be focused on, continuing to work on those things where there's still like a lot of ways to go. Take, for example, payments. They've almost doubled the number of people using Apple Pay in the United States and UK in the past 2 years during the pandemic. Nothing to expect but upside in some of those categories like that. So I wouldn't want to slow down, the number of places Apple Pay is accepted, for example.